So, after talking with friends that are not in the keyboard space a decent bit about what I'm doing and all my keyboard stuff, I realized that there's no good real guide for a lot of the current lingo going around. So, I'll say some things that I don't think are lingo and realize they are. So, I want to have a giant thing that I can just show to people. So, I've prepared here a PowerPoint of a bunch of different things that I'm just going to quickly voice over, maybe 10 seconds a slide, just go over some very basic, important pieces of lingo. We're going to start with the general keyboard items, so just general parts of a keyboard. The case, or the chassis of the case, is the back part, the bottom. It's what holds everything together. The PCB is the printed circuit board, which is where the electronics sit, and it's where the switches get soldered to, as well as the stabilizers can get screwed into. Connections happen here. It's the circuit board. The plate is a piece of typically metal, sometimes plastic, that sits below the switches above the PCB. It holds the it holds the switches in the right spot and can give sound properties, which I'll talk about later. Switches, the things that actually cause the actuation, your key presses, it's the things that make it go. When you feel anything when pushing down, that's what you feel. It's the switch. Stabilizers, often abbreviated to stabs, or as I've heard a couple times, stabs, which I guess makes sense, are the things that are placed on your longer keys in order to prevent them from wobbling when you press on the edges of them. They're particularly hard to tune in some cases to prevent bad noises from coming out of them. Keycaps are the parts that go on top of the switches. They come in many different profiles, multiple different materials, all of which have different sound properties. You can get them from many different manufacturers in many different colors. Keycaps. That's probably the one that most people are familiar with. Desk mats are large, full desk mats that are meant to take away some of the sound of desk vibrations and other things like that when you're typing, as well as just provide a very large mouse pad and some nice art. Now I'll get to some common materials. Aluminum, frequently abbreviated to alu. Cases are made of this. Plates are made of this. That's pretty much most of the things that are made of aluminum. Brass, another common case part used for weights, and brass is also fairly common as a plate material. Polycarbonate, often abbreviated to PC, sometimes used for some lower end plastic cases. There are some high end limited run polycarbonate boards and sometimes used as a plate as well. Polycarbonate is also used in certain switches. POM, also known as acetal, commonly used as plates, also fairly frequently used in switches. Acrylic, often used as plates. Here you can see a stacked acrylic case, stacked of thin sheets of acrylic. Can also be CNC'd into a full non-stacked case. Carbon fiber is another fairly frequent case material and plate material. Just carbon fiber. ABS is somewhat frequently used. It's typically used in 3D printing, but you can see ABS plates nowadays. And if you're getting a 3D printed board, it'll be made maybe out of ABS or PLA. Okay, this is a full black image because I just recently switched this. Anyway, PBT. It's a chemical symbol. It's a plastic. Keycaps are fairly frequently made of this. ABS is also a big keycap thing. Copper. Plates can be made of copper. Weights can be made out of copper. Some companies will do weights out of copper. I realize now that I've missed a couple important-ish materials. Two of which I can think of are nylon. Nylon is fairly frequently used in switches, in particular Cherry switches use nylon housings, and Umwipe, which is, I can't remember what it stands for. It is a plastic that is fairly good friction for its friction properties, so it's often used inside switches to make them smoother. All right, so now switch styles. There are MX style switches. MX style switches are the most common that you'll see. Originally, I believe, made by Cherry, but the patent has expired and many different companies make them. There are tactile MX switches, which you can see here. There is the little bump on the press, which gives you a tactile feedback. There's a little bump as you push down. There are linear MX style switches, where you see there are no bumps and it just feels smooth going all the way down. And there are two different types of clicky switches. There is click jacket clicky switches, where you can see here it's tactile, but since there's that moving housing, it also makes a audible clicking sound. There is also another way of doing clicky switches, which is the click bar switches. You can see that metal bar will actually get pushed out and snap, making a more clean clicking sound. These are found in some novel keys switches. There are also silent Cherry MX switches. You can see on the right is a silent stem. It's got little pieces of padding on the top and bottom so that when it hits the top and bottom of the key press, it will sound more deadened and not as loud. Franken switching is a very popular thing. Franken switching is taking different parts of different switches and putting them together to make new switches that you couldn't get off of a shelf. There are optical switches, which Razer has some optical switches. I believe Wooting uses they might be Hall Effect. And Gateron makes some optical switches that work as you can see here. It's a laser bouncing thing. Buckling spring switches are a very coveted old type of switch that works as seen here. They're found on very fairly old keyboards, 70s, 80s keyboards. Electrostatic or Topra switches use a rubber dome and a conical spring to give a nice, crisp, and fairly silent tactile feel. There is a fairly big cult following for Topra switches. Membrane switches are what you'd find in the standard school keyboards, office keyboards. They're rubber domes, no pieces of metal in them. They feel mushy. They are silent. They get grimy. They don't last super long. They're not great. Alps are another popular older switch. It's a switch style. There are, I believe, clicky and non-clicky Alps switches. They have a lot of parts, which is one of the problems with them and why there aren't many clones of them nowadays, because they can break fairly easily. They are not as durable. So I'll look at the internals of MX switches. I won't go into the other ones because MX is what pretty much everybody uses. Not everybody, but a lot of people. So first we'll look at the top housing. So you can see here is the top housing with all the spots named, the hole for the stem, the nameplate, legs so that it can clip together, and LED slot for LEDs. The bottom housing has the rails that guide the stem up and down. It has the leaf, which is what actually makes the electrical conduct. The center mast keeps things centered, and the LED slot, same as on the top. Here is a stem. The stem has the mount for the keycaps. The rails that go in the rails seen here. The rails go there. The center pole goes down that center hole, and the legs are what make contact with the leaf and cause it to actuate. Some switches have long poles, so the pole is notably longer, as you can see through these size comparisons. That can cause certain sounds and certain bottom out feels because it will bottom out faster. It'll get to the bottom of the key press faster. And the last part is the spring. There are multiple different spring lengths, spring weights. The weight of the spring typically dictates how hard it is to push down, along with the tactility of the switch. And the length of the switch can cause different amounts of weight to be needed the curve of the weight graph to be different. Switch manufacturers. Cherry. Cherry is the original people who made MX style switches. Cherry. Gateron. Gateron makes many good switches. They're fairly popular. Their inks are probably their most popular switch. Kailh. Kailh is another big switch manufacturer. Their biggest line is probably the Kailh Box series, which are IP rated 56, which is interesting, but not typically all that useful. However, their Novel Keys creams are fairly well known. Durock, or JWK, they are another switch manufacturer. They make a lot of really good high quality series, but a lot of their switches are very similar in terms of molds and materials. Texi is a relatively newer company that you come to see. They've gone around to a lot of different boutiques and shops and have been giving them custom switches, which has been pretty cool. Yock, sometimes not technically really known as B-Sun. They share the same factory. B-Sun doesn't really make much anymore. Yock does a lot of Panda Franken switching stuff. Their switches are typically meant to be Franken switched. SP Star, you'll see a decent amount of these. They're fairly popular. Not much more to say there. Otemu is typically what you'll find in those super budget keyboards you get off of like Amazon. Otemu is pretty bad for making like not very good switches, but there's one exception, which we'll get to in a moment. ACO makes some switches. ACO makes some really, really good budget switches. Their what's it called? CS line is really cheap and really good for the price, to be honest. Drop does make some switches. Particularly, they have the original one of a very coveted stem mold for one of the stems that is a really good quality tactile stem. They were formerly, I should probably say they're formerly known as Mastrop. Hako, otherwise known as, well, technically it's Input Club. Input Club makes Hako switches. They're just decent switches with, they're somewhat similar looking to Kailh's Box series. Zeal PC is a fairly well-known company. They use Gateron to actually produce their switches, but they are fairly well-known as their own switch developer. The Zeal PC Zelios are their most well-known. Gazoo is the one good exception to Otemu switches being bad. Gazoo is the designer for the Bobas, the Boba U4s, Boba U4Ts, Boba Gums, and Boba LTs. A large line of switches that are mostly very, very good. The Boba U4Ts are especially very popular as one of basically the best tactiles stock. So out of the box. Sizes and layouts of boards. 100%. Full size office keyboard. It's got everything. Well, it doesn't have everything. They're bigger, but I'm going with the standard stuff. Number pad, function row, all the keys. 96%. Just compresses everything and takes out some of the unused keys. It takes out unused keys, compresses things. This isn't every 96%, but it's a good idea of what a 96% looks like. A 10 keyless TKL 80% is a keyboard with no numpad. It's the full size with no numpad. That's pretty much it. 75%, it takes the 10 keyless and cuts it down slightly more. It just takes out that cluster to the right and kind of shrinks it down, squishes things together. It reduces the space it takes up on the right a little bit more. 65% takes the 75% and cuts off the function row. That's pretty much it. It's the first keyboard that has no function row, and it's the type of keyboard where you're going to start using layers, so pressing the function button to get to different layers and type other keys. 60% chops off the arrow keys and the right side stuff of a 65%. Definitely going to need function layers here if you want to have your arrow keys. They are a very popular size category, 60 and 65%. The 40% is a very wide range of different layouts. I've provided a couple different or 4 different options here. This is from one of the keyboards I plan on releasing soon. 40% requires a lot of layers, are a bit wonky, take a bit to get used to, and require some fancy keycap sets. But if you really want to save space and don't want to move your hands around your keyboard a lot, it can be a very good option. There are also a lot of ergonomic keyboards. I separated this out later because there are a lot of different sizes for them. This one here is the Moonlander, if I'm not mistaken. They're split. They allow you to keep your hands tented and in more ergonomic positions. Notable ergonomic keyboards are the Alice layout. This is a full-size Alice layout, but Alice comes in many different sizes. And as you can see, it kind of tilts the hands inwards so that you're not straightening and scrunching your shoulders. Now, I'm interested that I'm going into this next. Column staggered, and as we'll get to, ortholinear are 2 different ways that keys are laid out on the board. So you can see here that the columns are staggered, whereas on an ortholinear, everything is very, very straight. The majority of smaller, like super compressed keyboards are ortholinear. They can take a bit of getting used to. I don't see the real point in them personally, but to each their own. This can frequently be abbreviated to ortho keyboards. Hand-wired keyboards are fairly popular, especially in the 40s space. You can see here, this is a 3D printed hand-wired keyboard. All the switches are wired by hand. One of the most common hand-wired switches or hand-wired keyboards is the Dactyl Manuform, which is a 3D printed ergonomic split keyboard. It is based off of the Dactyl, which also still has is still fairly popular as another ergo split keyboard. These keyboards come in many different sizes. The Manuform shown here is a 5x7, which is a little bit more rare of layout, but personally my favorite. You can get them much smaller, like only 4 rows size. They're very customizable. ErgoDox is another very popular ergonomic keyboard. The Dactyl Manuform and the ErgoDox are all ortholinear keyboards. The ErgoDox is very similar looking to the Dactyl Manuform, just not bubbled, curved, whatever you want to call it. Still has a lot of the features of like tenting and better ergonomics from the split keyboardness. Mounting styles. This is how the different parts of the keyboard in a more standard keyboard go together. Tray mount. Tray mount is what you see in most commercial boards. If you're going to get it off a shelf, it's probably a tray mount. If you're getting it off Amazon, it's probably a tray mount. There are holes in sometimes not even holes in the plate, they're just really long screws. And you screw the PCB or the plate into the bottom of the case. Typically, this is done with way too many mounting points, and it gives a uneven mounting feel. Top mount is more commonly found in enthusiast options, not as much recently. It's where you screw the plate into the top of the case, and then the top of the case is screwed into the bottom. It is a much more balanced typing feel, though it's still a little harsher than some of the other ones that we'll get to. I don't think I've ever actually seen a bottom mount keyboard, but it's just the top mount reversed. It's a much more balanced version of tray mount. That's a bit different. I don't know. I've never actually seen it used. Sandwich mount is when you sandwich the plate between the top and the bottom using a screw. This isn't very common. However, it gives way to another mounting style that I'll get to in a moment. Integrated plate is also fairly common with budget options and options that you get off of the shelf. It keeps the plate that holds the switches in place that I spoke about earlier, and builds it into part of the case. It does do a slightly better job of distributing the feel, but typically it's also mixed with tray mount. The upgrade on sandwich mount is gasket mount, where instead of just holding it together with the sandwich, it will use gaskets to isolate the sound and feeling. It can also give a good amount more flexiness to the typing, making it softer to press all the way down and giving it a bouncier feel. Another gasket style mounting is gummy O-ring mounting. It's where you take a large O-ring, wrap it around in between the plate and the PCB. As shown here, it's a black gummy O-ring. And then mount that at certain points on a case. Typically, this is done with tray mount boards. And that will give it a little bit more bouncy of a feel and not be as harsh sounding, not as the sound of the board won't go into the case as much, the outside of the key press. Burger mounting can be done with the majority of tray mount, top mount boards, probably bottom mount as well. It's where you take some O-rings and sandwich them on either side of the whatever you're screwing in. So if you have a tray mount board that's screwing the PCB into the bottom, you put a O-ring on the bottom of the PCB and on the top of the PCB. It's basically a more direct version of the last mod, the O-ring mod, or O-ring mounting. Plateless just removes the plate. I'm getting into this for the next mounting style, but some people prefer plateless because it gives a bit of a softer bottom out feel because there's less stiffness due to there not being two pieces of material, only one piece of material holding everything in place. It can be dangerous if the board is not designed for it. The PCB might break from flexing, but that's very uncommon. The reason I got into this is plateless gasket. With the majority of gaskets, it uses the plate to hold it in. Plateless gasket has specific tabs for the gasket pads on the PCB so that you can have a plateless gasket mount and get a very, very flexible typing feel. Half plate is another fairly popular thing. Half plate is just cutting out the center, like the alphanumeric, or not the alphanumeric, to make it more flexy on that area while still giving the sturdiness of the outside and making it a bit more structurally sound. Notable abbreviations of things that people will say. F13. F13 can be included in like keyboard names and stuff like that. F13 just means it has a spot for an F13 key. It doesn't need to be an F13. You can use things to change it to whatever you like. Use the different firmwares to change it to whatever you like, but it's there. Another thing I can get into here is stepped caps lock. Older keyboards had a stepped caps lock. Basically, the heights of the keys are different. The height of the key is different at different points in the key. It's another thing you might encounter hearing. WKL is known as Windows keyless, or Win keyless. It models after older boards that did not have the super key or the Windows key. You can see that here in this layout clearly in the bottom row. Windows keys are missing. I don't understand this layout. I really don't. But for the aesthetics, I guess. FRL or FROless, less common, but you can see here it's a TKL, 10 keyless, but with no function row. It's not quite a 75% or a 65%, but it kind of is. FROless. It just makes it a bit easier to, instead of adding more percentages. Keycaps. Of course, you can't see this. Wonderful. I love that I use the black and white logo. GMK. Here, you know what? Haha. Oh, whatever. GMK is a very, very popular keycap manufacturer. They do a lot of keycap sets. They also have very, very long lead times. Their most popular profile, which we'll get into later, is Cherry. GMK is a German company founded by the three names up there that I'm not going to bother butchering. Milky Way is or MW, is a much more recent to the scene keycap manufacturer. They are very similar to Cherry. However, unlike Cherry, which uses double shot, so 2 shots of plastic, Milky Way uses a special form of dye sublimation, which is good, but not necessarily as high quality. Both GMK and Milky Way will make their keycaps out of ABS, whereas the next one, Enjoy PBT, will make their keycaps out of PBT. Enjoy PBT mostly do Cherry keycaps. They do some ABS keycaps as well. You'll frequently see them mentioned as EBPT. They do a lot of in-stock keycaps, unlike GMK, which you can pretty much never find in stock, and mostly the same with Milky Way. Keyreative is another company. They do some more exotic keycap profiles, Cam and Cat. They use both dye sublimation and dual shot ABS keycaps. They also, like GMK, have really long lead times right now. Signature Plastics, best known for the SA profile of keycaps. You don't see them around too much, but they do make keycaps. If you see SP and it isn't followed with a dash star, you're probably looking at SP Signature Plastics keycaps. Taihao makes a bunch of budget keycaps that may or may not be knockoffs of other keycaps made by the other companies. Buy them at your own risk. They might not be as good quality, but you can get them cheaper. ACO, they make switches. They also make keycaps. They have some of their own proprietary keycap profiles, which are a bit weird, ASA being one of them. They also make a good amount of XDA profile. We're about to get into profiles in a second. And they also make a lot of clones, just like Taihao. Here are the profiles. This isn't all of the profiles. This is just the ones I'm showing you. There are a lot of profiles. SA, Signature Plastics. Taihao. SA is a very dished high keycap set. Taihao is a flat high keycap set. Cat is a slightly shorter version of SA, basically less dished slightly. OEM is what Cat is to SA for Taihao is to OEM. OEM is very, very popular. Any budget option pretty much is OEM. If you're getting keycaps that come with a keyboard, they're OEM profile. Cherry is the shorter version of OEM profile. They are very popular. Cherry is in the enthusiast scene is the most popular. GMK, Milky Way, EPBT, they make their keycaps in Cherry profile. XDA, less common, fairly common on some more budget options. ACO makes some, as I mentioned. Cam is you can see here, the XDA, Cam, and DSA are all the same, where you can see all the different rows of keys are the same height. XDA, Cam, and DSA just being slightly different sizes. Cam being Keyreatives, and DSA being relatively easy to find. And then there I just have some other ones that you can see that are more common for a regular person. Bow or WOB, black on white or white on black, is a fairly popular keycap coloring scheme. So black text on white keycap or white text on black keycap You can see it there. It's pretty well illustrated. Novelties are a thing you might also hear about fairly frequently. It refers to keycaps with icons on them. They're a fairly big part about buying a nice custom keycap set is the novelties, because you get some little fancy art. Artisans are very painstakingly made keycaps, typically done in very small batches that are very pretty. You can see here there are some unbelievably impressively designed artisan keycaps. You might also hear artisan keycaps referred to as resins, because they typically use a significant amount of resin. I've separated that out here because I'd say that resins are more of a subcategory. There are a lot of clay-based artisan keycaps as well. Here are a bunch of mods or modifications that you might hear someone in keyboards talk about. Foam modding is putting foam behind the PCB in order to reduce the amount of case sound and hollowness of the sound of the board. Hollowness being like echoiness and some maybe pinging from the metal. Silicone pores are just more advanced foam modding where you use silicone. It makes it a bit heavier, which is nice. It gives you a bit more premium of a feel. It's a much more molded fit instead of kind of cutting out of foam, and it can typically give a better sound. Plate foam is putting plate between the PCB and the plate. I said that right? I think so. It helps mute out some unwanted sounds. Some people are all for it. Some people are against it because it can take out some sounds that people like in their keyboards. PE or polyethylene foam is something that's come out a bit more recently. You put this between the switch and the PCB. You can see that there are a bunch of small holes for the switch legs. It changes the sound of the switches. In my opinion, it makes a lot of switches sound very, very similar. A lot of people kind of agree there. But I will say that the sound it gives is reasonably desirable. It kind of sounds like typing on marbly, as you might hear. I'm going to get into that later. The Holy mod is a mod for stabilizers, attempting to remove and stop them from making unwanted noise. Rattle, as it is typically called. Holy mod is done by stuffing a bandage inside the stabilizer in a particular way as to remove ticking sounds. The EPSI mod is very similar to Holy mod. It just uses a leftover part from a different mod so that you can combine your mods into one and reduce costs. Or just use what you've already got because it's leftovers. Why not? Band-Aid modding is basically putting Band-Aids on the PCB to avoid having your stabilizers hit the PCB. Somewhat outdated of a mod. Many of the decent tier stabilizers that you'd get for a higher quality board don't hit the PCB. However, some crappier plate mount stabilizers, so stabilizers that clip into the plate, might make some bad noise. Tape modding the plate. There's a different tape mod. It's got an extra thing at the front. Some people call this Band-Aid modding. I disagree with them. Is putting little pieces of tape, where I've circled there, to prevent plate mount stabilizers from moving around in the spot. It's basically tolerances aren't always the best. This helps deal with bad tolerances, basically. Tempest tape mod, also frequently referred to as the tape mod, is putting tape on the back of your PCB to reduce the hollowness of a case. It's quite nice. It upgrades lower quality keyboards to give them a slightly nicer sound, and it does change the sound profile of the keyboard. People do it with Scotch tape, people do it with painter's tape, people do it with duct tape, people do it with electrical tape, and they actually all have different sounds, which is really interesting, to be honest. The most important mod that you'll hear a lot about is lubing. It's taking lubricants and putting them at different precise points on the switch in order to reduce unwanted scratchiness, so friction between different parts. Places where you'll put them, as if you want to refer back to earlier in the video, would be almost always you're going to put it on the rails, and definitely on the spring to reduce spring pinginess and metallic sounds. And then on linear switches, typically people will lube the legs and the leaf in order to reduce friction there. However, with a tactile switch where you want to feel the bump, you typically leave that unlubed. The other switch-based mod that people do is filming. Switch films are, once again, a way of dealing with not as great tolerances. So that when you clip the top and bottom back together, they are very tightly fit together. As I mentioned earlier, the EPSI mod uses extras from Deskey's films. Different lubricants. This is basically, you'll see a bunch of random letters and numbers. This is what to make of them. Krytox GPL 105, Krytox 105, is an oil that's typically used on springs. This helps reduce the spring pinging, as I mentioned earlier. Krytox GPL 205 grade 2 is a fairly quite thick lubricant made by the same company as before, Chemours and the Krytox brand. You don't typically see this used. I'm mentioning it here because GPL 205 grade 0 or 205G0 is a very, very popular switch lubricant for linear switches. It's a relatively thick lubricant that is actually made by combining 105 and 205 grade 2 in equal parts by weight. It's best to get it directly from the factory mixed because it can separate a bit more if it's not mixed at the factory. However, to save some costs, you can actually mix it yourself. Tribosis 3203 is a different brand of lubricants. 3203 is fairly popular because it is great for tactile switches. It is slightly thinner than 205 grade 0 and the next switch lubricant we'll talk about. So fairly popular for tactiles where you don't want as much lubricant. Tribosis 3204 is the thicker version of Tribosis' lubricants. I've spelled Tribosis here wrong. Great job, me. It's written in the picture. It's Tribosis' equivalent to 205 grade 0. Some people prefer to use this. Krytox XHT-BDZ is a stabilizer wire lubricant. Do not use that on your switches. It is thick. It's meant to reduce rattle on wires, stabilizer wires. So the wires that connect the two different sides of the stabilizer. That might not be clear. Dielectric grease is another thing that can be used in place of XHT-BDZ. It is cheaper for a much bigger bulk, but unlike all of the Krytox brand lubricants, it does not last as long, not nearly as long. You might end up needing to reapply dielectric grease, but it does do a pretty good job. Sounds. I'm going to say sounds and then not give audio representations of these sounds because there is no agreement on what actually is these sounds. I'll give some slight descriptions, but it's up for you to decide for yourself. It's just things you might hear someone say. Thawky, thawk, as with the C's, is what is usually used to refer to a deeper switch. So or a deeper sound. When you press down on the switch and it sounds deeper. That's the best way of putting it. Clacky is typically used as the opposite of thawky. Clack is a higher pitched sound signature. So high pitch. Poppy is kind of like clacky. I think it sounds like the Switch is making a pop sound is the best way to put it. You'll hear this used less frequently than thawk or clack, but still fairly frequently. Clicky is the sound that clicky switches make. It is the sharp clicking sound, so made by the ones that I mentioned earlier, the ones with click bars and click jackets. That is clicky. That is what a clicky switch makes. Linear switches and tactile switches do not make clicky sounds. I've had that mistake made a couple times by some people. Wet or over-lubed is another sound signature you might hear. It's caused by adding too much or too thick of a lubricant to a switch, and it sounds wet and mushy and kind of disgusting. You never want to hear this, really, but it exists. It can happen. Muted is a sound signature mainly of a full board. It's where it doesn't, like when not even using silent switches, the board seems almost too quiet. Some people really like muted sound signatures, some people really don't, and it typically revolves around the amount of foam that you've put in the board. Hollow is another full board sound. It's typically referring to a very echoey sound, where there's too much space in the board that will cause a hollowness. Most notably on space bars, typically. The Tempest tape mod and foam modding fixes hollowness, whereas overdoing those would lead to muted. Ticking is another sound. Ticking is in reference to stabilizers, typically. It's an unwanted noise that basically is just a little tick that gets kind of annoying when you've lubricated everything and everything sounds super clean except for that space bar where the stabilizer isn't super well modded and it's got that ticking sound. There was another sound. Oh, yes. One that I managed to exclude. As I mentioned earlier, marbly. Marbly is it sounds kind of like the switches. I don't know how to describe marbly, but it's always caused by PE foam, one of the mods mentioned earlier. There are multiple keyboards, higher end ones that have PE foam made for the board, such as the Jelly Epoch and the Mr. Suit. Marbly is very nice, but typically it overrides the sound of any other switch. If the switch isn't thawky and marbly, it's just marbly. Interesting, to be honest. Now we'll get into some development terms you might hear, as well as like board programming and firmware things. QMK is the biggest firmware used on higher end mechanical keyboards. Pretty much anything you get as soon as you get into the enthusiast scene will use QMK. It stands for Quantum Mechanical Keyboard, and it is fantastic. There are multiple different ways of going about using QMK. You can use their online configurator, or you can use their it's called QMK MySys to compile files on your PC. It offers a wide range for different levels of technical competency, but there's a upgrade to it later in here. ZMK is the primary Bluetooth and wireless Bluetooth and wireless firmware. Due to copyright and other laws, it's harder to make use of Bluetooth modules in firmware. So ZMK is the Bluetooth version of QMK. It doesn't have as many features, and it's a bit more frustrating to develop in, but you might hear it thrown around every once in a while, especially when you're hearing about wireless boards. VIA is a program that's based off of QMK. Not all QMK boards are VIA compatible, but VIA is just a much faster way of being able to reprogram and program a board using basic QMK stuff. It is the most simple programming tool. KRK, or Keyboard Render Kit, is a Blender add-on made by Imperfect Link, used for, that has a bunch of basic keyboard chassis in them that are used for making renders for keycaps and other things. Keyboard Layout Editor, which I've used many times in this video, KLE, is used for just showing layouts and developing layouts on a keyboard, so where all the keys go. Another important thing for development is the AIO3 plate generator. AIO3 being a big name in keyboards, made many very good quality keyboards and simplified so much of stuff for development. If you're looking for keyboard guides, go to him or them. I don't actually know. The AIO3 plate generator is something you might hear about, though, when looking at developing things. Now, I think this is the last section, layouts that you might hear about. There is the standard QWERTY layout. That's what you see normally. There's Dvorak, which is meant to be faster to type on. It is pretty hard to get keycaps set that have the right row layout for Dvorak, but it is apparently significantly faster once you get used to it. Colmac is meant to be a hybrid between QWERTY and Dvorak, which is easier to find keycap sets for, if I'm not mistaken, and a lot simpler to learn. And then the last couple things are ANSI, and as we'll get into ISO. ANSI is actually talking about an institute, the American National Standards Institute. It is the American Standard Keyboard layout. So it typically refers to the enter and where all of in the core of the board, where each key is, as opposed to ISO. I don't remember what ISO stands for. However, the big key indicator of ISO is the big enter over on the right, and some slightly weird layouts, backslash kind of just being in the bottom left, a smaller shift. There's other layouts that are fairly common, not as common as ISO and ANSI, but there's JIS, the Japanese layout. There are, I believe there's a Russian layout as well. There are many different layouts. These are just the most popular. And that kind of brings me to the end of all the things that I could think of. If you can think of more things that need brief definitions, just let me know. I might do more of this. I just wanted to get this out so I could explain to some friends what certain things I say mean. Thanks.